Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third of 5 Sunday afternoons in our Appalachian Studies Summer Authors Series. My name is Susan Poole, and I'm the Director of the College for Seniors here at the North Carolina Center for Creative Retirement. If you've had the opportunity to hear any of the other authors who have previously spoken to us, Tommy Hayes, Charles Frazier, Thomas Raincrow, I think, I know you'll understand when I say you're in for another very special afternoon. And if it is this the first time that you are joining us, you're in for a very special afternoon. These talks by great Southern authors is made possible by a $100,000 grant from the Bernard Osher Foundation. Effective August the 1st, in just a few short weeks, the North Carolina Center for Creative Retirement will become the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and join over 120 lifelong learning institutes around the country dedicated to promoting learning for the love of it. And in just a few short weeks, Catherine Frank, our Executive Director, and I will be attending the Southern Regional Conference on Learning in Retirement in Jacksonville, Florida, where we will meet with other members of other lifelong learning institutes around the Southeast. At a workshop on hot topics in curriculum, I will have the opportunity to share the creation and implementation of this wonderful and unique series that we have been able to put on for you with other conference members. And in case you're wondering about the very pregnant videographer who was here on our first Sunday, she is now the proud mom of her 4th child, a son born last night, Colin, 9 pounds, 10 ounces. We're not sure if she's going to be here next week or not. I would like to introduce Steve Woody, who will in turn introduce Wayne Caldwell. Steve was born in Waynesville, and his ancestors are from Cataloochee. His grandparents live in Cataloochee. His father was born in Cataloochee. Steve is in charge this year of the 75th anniversary of a reunion of families with ties to Cataloochee. A former naval officer, he is one of the founders of the Friends of the Smokies. Steve attended UNC Chapel Hill 3 times between 1960 and 1982, and I'm sure there's a story there somewhere. Steve and Wayne have collaborated in this effort of back and forth talking with each other before, and we're delighted that they have agreed to do this for us again. Steve Woody, Wayne Caldwell.
Thank you. Thanks, man. Thank you. Good afternoon. Let's set the record straight. I am not an author. And Wayne and I have done this before, and the last time we did it, the Asheville Citizen-Times said, Cataloochee author and elder. So I guess that put me in my place. I'm here to introduce Wayne, among other things, but first I want to introduce Hannah Epperson. Stand up, Hannah. She's in the back in the green shirt. Hannah is a graduate of UNC Asheville. She is a AmeriCorps volunteer with Friends of the Smokies in our Waynesville office. And if you know that name, that's because on Saturday and Sunday mornings from 7 to 10, she is the host on WCQS. That's where you've heard her. And she leaves us the end of this month, but on September the 1st, she is going to be an AmeriCorps volunteer with the Nature Center here in Asheville. Wayne Caldwell. Wayne is a native of Buncombe County. He is the recipient of the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award for his book, Requiem by Fire. This book right here. He won that last year. He attended UNC Chapel Hill, but only once. He has a master's from Appalachian State and a PhD in English from Duke University. He is a former college professor, and when he is not writing prize-winning novels, he's a partner at Ambiance Interiors. He is married to Mary, raise your hand, Mary, who is an ordained Baptist minister and who is the Ethics and Values Coordinator at Mission Health Center. We're here to talk about Cataloochee and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And we will be here for questions and answers, and we'll be here after all that. So if you have something you want to talk about, raise your hand when we get through. Eudora Welty once said, quote, "A place that was ever lived in is like a fire that never goes out." And that is certainly true of Cataloochee. All of us who call Cataloochee home know it's a special place. People lived in Cataloochee Valley for about 100 years, from the 1830s until about the 1930s when the park came. This valley, their home, calls them back every year to a reunion. And as Susan said, we're about to celebrate our 75th reunion. It's not a family reunion, but a reunion of the families who lived in Cataloochee. And I'd like to read you a couple of things that were said. This is from the Waynesville Mountaineer discussing Sunday, August 8, 1937. "No picture shown a scene as happy as old and young gather in Cataloochee Valley to meet relatives and old friends and renew expressions of esteem and friendship on last Sunday. Jonathan Woody of Atlanta, my father, formerly of Cataloochee and son of Steve Woody, my grandfather, made the opening address. He stressed the fact that this reunion should be held every year in honor of those that have passed on, the older ones who take such pride in the occasion, and the younger people might know the feeling of friendship that has always existed in this locality among kinsmen and neighbors." Following the open address, a native of Cataloochee, the Reverend Brown Caldwell, now a prominent Baptist minister in Greenville, South Carolina, preached the sermon that was most uplifting to everyone. Following the opening, dinner was spread on the chapel lawn, which was ample for many times more than the 600 or 700 who gathered. That's what we do in Cataloochee. Now, a Dr. Robert Woody, who was a history professor at Duke, anybody have him years ago? He spoke at the 1949 reunion, and in January of 1950, he had a paper in the South Atlantic Quarterly, which I believe is a history magazine. He said, he was writing about the reunion. He said, "The meeting is held at a little Methodist church, Palmer Chapel. Nearly everyone is closely related by blood and marriage to be called cousin. The reading of the names of the settlers who had died within the year is listened to in silence, and a bell is rung. A visiting member of the group makes the talks. Several songs of Zion are sung. They look at pictures and they meet old friends." Now this is important. This was in 1949. He said, "The time approaches when these reunions must cease, for ultimately there will be none left who was born or reared in Cataloochee. But the reunion goes on, and probably will." Now, I'm going to pass a picture of the reunion that was taken about 5 or 6 years ago around, and whoever winds up with it, please bring it back, because this is my only copy. So we'll start it right over here. Okay. Wayne?
This is a piece from a new book that I'm writing. The tentative title is Memoirs of an Unambitious Lawyer. I don't know if it'll stay that way, but I like the title. Anybody ever met an unambitious lawyer? Just curious. Thanks, Steve. And this piece is called Reunion, and it may tell you a little bit of the difference in how a novelist looks at the same stuff that Steve just read to you from the newspaper. My unambitious lawyer, by the way, is 85 years old, and he is writing in a memoir in the first person and is looking back on a lot of different things, but this is his take on reunion. I always look forward to the big Cataloochee reunion, where the descendants of the founding Cataloochee families meet at the Methodist Church for a memorial service and dinner on the ground. Sometimes there's picking and singing, and always delightful home-cooked food, although some have been known to buy buckets of fried chicken to put on their own platters. In August, there are tons of homegrown tomatoes, creamed corn, and melons, not to mention peach cobblers and coconut cakes and fried apple pies. Criminy, it makes my mouth water. Plus, there's women to hug, pitchers of iced tea and lemonade to drink, and catching up to do. I'd like to think the first reunion's roots were in my father's Cataloochee campground fire a few years before. By that week's end, every campsite emptied of an evening to hear the old men hold forth, and it was more than mere entertainment. Amusing, sure, to hear old-timers tell of bear, panthers, and revenue men, but it also ensured this odd culture would live in some form more authentic than Snuffy Smith or Jed Clampett. It's no accident the reunion's formalities happen Sunday morning in the old clapboard church, for it's there we pay homage to the religion that kept us from going nuts from the downright numbing hardship of being. A keynoter, anyone from a preacher to a politician, serves as bard to keep the tradition alive. There's hymn singing and prayer, and someone solemnly reads the names of those who have gone to their reward during the past year. At each name, the bell is tolled, and it makes every hair on your body stand as straight as a Marine in dress blues. At the 49 get-together, the keynoter was a Haywood County boy, kin to Silas Wright, who had made good. He had become a professor of one of the social sciences at Duke. Now, I'm not one to question the intelligence of a person in such a distinguished position, but in August he sported a tweed jacket with elbow patches, dangled a pipe at precisely the right angle, and sweated like a Georgia mule. We applauded when he was introduced. After all, he was one of us. He talked a long time, and as Mama used to say about the preacher, he missed a lot of stopping places. But when he said, "The time approaches when these reunions must cease, for ultimately there will be none left who was born or reared on Cataloochee," we looked at each other, shook our heads, and said, "Bless his heart," under our breath. Because he didn't understand the strong pull of the land, and not to mention the threat of being haunted by one's forefathers, which lures 50 years later 500 or 600 descendants to the ancestral ground. So much for book learning. When it was over, the applause was barely polite, but we let him eat with us anyway. At reunion a year or two ago, a young woman asked to tape my stories. A freckledy redhead, about 20, wearing shorts and a midriff-bearing shirt. Of course, I said yes. That afternoon, I downed about a gallon of iced tea while telling a few stories I knew mostly to be true. Some I figured had been doctored, and a smattering of out-and-out lies just to keep in practice. Remember, I'm a lawyer. But I told her which ones were which. I'm an honest lawyer. Last fall, a letter asked permission to use my words in a master's thesis, which flattered me until I read the title. Deconstructing Appalachia, Bonnets, Stills, Hillbillies, and Other Stereotypes in the Making of the Eastern National Park. Blamed if that wasn't a tongue twister. I had only a vague notion such a thing as Appalachian studies existed, but darned if you can't get a degree in it. Or is it them? I sure don't want to sit in on any classes, for I suspect professors from up north pronounce Appalachian with 5 syllables, the third of which is long A. Made me wonder how accurate her other oral material might, well, I'll not do that. I'm looking forward to the reunion for the food and drink, but mostly because we immerse ourselves in story. We catch up on the lives of relatives and friends and reminisce about what we and our forebears experienced, and try to figure out how we fit into that narrative, a narrative we plan to tell and retell lest it vanished, for it's who we are.
We said we'd tell some stories, and I'll tell one right now about the reunion that happened 2 years ago. We had a gentleman named Gudger Palmer, who was 100 years old. And his nephew is Donald Davis, the very famous storyteller, one of the most famous storytellers in America. And after the service, they were sitting under a tree, and Gudger always sat on the same tree, and he was sitting there, and he looked at Donald, and he said, "You know, Donald," he said, "people are a lot better now than when I was a boy." And Donald said, "Well, why was that, Uncle Gudger?" He said, "Well," he said, "when I was a boy," he said, "we had to have preaching in there twice a month, and now we just have to have it once a year." We're talking about Cataloochee Valley. Where is Cataloochee Valley? I know you can't see this. This is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. All of this right here, this is Cataloochee. If you come up later, I'll show you where it is. It's a very remote valley, one of the most remote valleys in the Smokies, and certainly one of the more remote places in eastern America. History. Now, I want to have some dates and some figures in here, and pay attention. There may be a quiz when we get through. The first people in the valley obviously were the Cherokees, but there is no archaeological evidence that there was any permanent settlers there, probably because the valley was too small and they were better valleys. When you think about over near Cherokee and Franklin and the big wide rivers and the big broad valleys was where the Cherokee had their towns. But they were there, and they were well-established trails, and they found campsites and fire pits and so forth. So they were in there. In November of 1796, one John Blunt, Blunt County, Tennessee, and David Allison got a land grant for 570,000 plus acres, which included Cataloochee. And then in 1798, one John Strother purchased only 176,000 of those acres, which included Cataloochee, from Blunt. But he returned the land in his will. I don't know why. Then came along Colonel Robert Love, which is the name that's well known in western North Carolina. Love was a Revolutionary War veteran and a major landowner in Tennessee and North Carolina. Colonel Love was a member of the 1824 survey party that set the boundary between Tennessee and North Carolina, and that included Cataloochee. At his death in 1834, the remainder of his estate, including Cataloochee, was conveyed to his son for $3,000. That was in 1834. And by 1865, the Love holdings were only $375,000. That's known as the Love speculation. Now you'd call him, instead of a speculator, he'd be a developer. Cataloochee was part of Haywood County, which was established in 1808. The earliest settlers, the earliest deed was in 1814 to a Henry Caldwell. That was later changed to Caldwell. And over the next 20 years, there were several deeds given, but nobody lived there permanently. There were cattle drovers and a few hunters and fishermen, but they always returned in the fall to their permanent homes. It was not until the mid-1830s that settlement began in earnest. And the first family in were the Caldwells, the Hannahs, the Nolans, the Bennetts, the Palmers, the Woodies, and the Cooks. Now, Cataloochee is separated by Nolan Mountain. So we have Big Cataloochee and we have Little Cataloochee. But by the 1850s, there were enough people to have a church and a school. Wayne?
That Henry Caldwell was my great-great-grandfather. I first learned about Cataloochee really from finding out that my grandfather was born there. I had no idea about that. I never knew my grandfather, but when I was told that, I said, oh, okay, that's cool. And then some years later, I actually went to Cataloochee. My father was a Caldwell, but if you said the word family reunion to him, he ran the other way very quickly. He just didn't want to have any part of that kind of thing. So I didn't learn a lot of these stories growing up. I came to them later in life. But the first time I went to Cataloochee, I looked around and I said, you know, this is really ancestral ground. I'm on holy ground here. And another thought I had that first day I saw it would be really neat to set a novel here. And I didn't know at that point I wanted to write a novel, but there you go. And then here some years later comes Cataloochee. And this is part of the beginning of a chapter in which my hero, young Ras Carter, who, by the way, is that unambitious lawyer in the next book I'm working on, goes and reflects a little bit on his life in the valley. Ras Carter's father, Levi Marion, kept as fine a farm as anyone in Haywood County, but Ras wanted no part of it when he grew up. Born in Big Cataloochee the year the cloudburst killed old Sal, Ras was not exactly lazy, but as his father put it, he kept his head in the clouds or his nose in a book. The summer he turned 12, he was sent to the high pasture by his great-uncle John to check on the cattle. A boy felt grown up to be by himself so far above the valley, just himself and Columbine the mule, getting ready to spend the night under the stars. Ras fancied himself an author and had lately written some 3- and 4-page stories about cowboys. It's an Appalachian kid. It's a natural thing to do, right? When I was a kid, I wrote haiku. And I hope that stuff has been destroyed because, you know, it's not a natural thing for an Appalachian guy to do. But for weeks, Ras had anticipated this trip. He might even make a story out of it. As he listened to the clopping mule, he realized how noisy the valley had become. The creek made a constant racket. People shouted to one another across the fields and stopped in the road to chit-chat. Grain mills ground to the slow squeak of water-turned axles. Mowing machinery clattered behind teams of equines. Blacksmiths pumped bellows and beat red iron into shape. And in 1928, 6 or 7 automobiles and Lige Howell's Model T pickup putted around, stirring dust and scaring horses. He reined Columbine to a stop. Up here was breeze, an occasional cricket chirp, and the twisty, unwinding sound of what his teacher called cicadas, but the old folks called jarflies. He really noticed a difference when he rested Columbine. As she snorted, he patted her haunch. He stopped, totally motionless, listening to what at first, to a second of 7 children, sounded like absolutely nothing. He heard no rushing water, but noticed the green sound of wind in the tree canopy. It was likely 10 degrees cooler up there than down in the valley. He had heard rumors of the national park since he was 8, but had no clear idea of what that might mean for him. Rumors shifted places with information when it came to park news. Some said you could stay after the government took over, and some said everyone would have to leave right away. Moving sounded to him like an adventure, and he had imagined himself in a big place like Asheville, or even New York. Ras picked a sprig of grass and sucked the sweet end. No wonder cattle like grass, he thought. A fella could get used to life up here. But park or no park, one of these days he planned to go somewhere. His cousin Clyde made $10 a week at the paper mill in Canton and didn't work half as hard as Ras's father. In his high fantasies, he went to New York, or even Hollywood, having written a book that became a moving picture. His teacher said that Burroughs fellow who wrote about Tarzan was a millionaire. Ras had just finished Zane Gray's The UP Trail, which his teacher had loaned him, saying Gray just fished and only wrote when he needed more money. His imagination spent money on a European car for himself, a grand piano for his mother, and a new farm far removed from the threat of a national park for his father. Or if he made enough money, maybe he could persuade the park to go elsewhere so his father could keep the farm intact. And then he gets scared by a bear.
So in the 1850s, they had a church and a school. In 1851, the North Carolina legislature created the Jonathan Creek and Tennessee Mountain Turnpike Company. It followed the general path of the Native Americans from Cove Creek Gap through Mount Sterling Gap into Tennessee. It was completed in 1860, so it took a long time. And it's still there, and it's the road in there, and it's a curvy, unpaved road. But it was their road.
That's what we call a bitch in the mountains.
That's right. Now, residents were exempt from paying tolls, but they had to perform 6 days of free labor on the road and upkeep. And my father, who was born in 1895, used to say that, 1896, he used to say that as a little boy, one of his favorite things was that everybody had to work 2 days on the road. But it was sort of a holiday thing because the women bought big lunches in baskets and the men worked on places in the road that needed work. And his job at about age 6 or 7 was to carry the water bucket. And he felt so grown up. But that was the settlers. After the Civil War, with the completion of the turnpike, the population really started to grow in Cataloochee. Now, here comes some figures. 1870, there were 198 people in the valley by census. 1880, there were 391. 20 years later, it hit the high point. This is 1910. There were 1,251 people in the census. But by 1920, that had dropped to 930 people. Now, a couple of things happened. The valley was full, and there was no longer room for the children. There were 8 in my father's family, and none of them stayed in the valley. It was just too full. And also, the 1918 flu epidemic had come through and had done its toll in the valley. So there was no space for the younger generations. There was nowhere, nothing they could do unless, just work at the home place. Wayne?
I don't know where to insert this comment, but this is as good a place as any. Times were changing, as Steve said, in the valley. Land had been inherited a couple of generations by that time, and it was getting so that, if you were working less than about 50 acres of land, you weren't going to do any good. And this fellow named Linton Palmer came up to me at reunion one weekend, and he said, "Wayne, I want to tell you something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "The park done us a favor." I said, "How's that?" "We was running out of cousins to marry." And I said, "Okay." And this was when I was just beginning to get into researching this book, and I thought, okay, well, and there's a little bit of truth to that, I think. But getting back to getting the word about the park and figuring out you're going to have to leave or do something, the actual announcement was made in church. And although that seems to be an odd place for this to have gotten out, that's the account. And here's a fictional look at what happened in church that morning. The clapboard church with 3 double-hung windows on the east and west sides seated maybe 100 comfortably, but today everybody hunkered together. Men stood all the way around the walls, 5 deep along the back. Uncle Will tapped his tuning fork on the pulpit and hummed the key for a chorus of "On Christ the Solid Rock I Stand." Levi Marion and his family sat near the west wall, crowded together like refugees. Elijah brought his usual wagon load of boarders who stood outside. 3 dark men in the southeast corner stood out like porcupines at a fancy wedding. Dirty, unshaven faces and hobnail boots bespoke Loggy Woods boys, drovers, or just plain trouble. After Solid Rock, they went into Rock of Ages and finished with Amazing Grace. Uncle Will had chosen well from the congregation's shared foundation. Smith closed his eyes in a silent prayer. These are their life, their creed, their deliverance. These people are going to need a lot of Jesus to get through this. So am I. When they sat and shuffled feet and coughed, Preacher Smith stood behind the pulpit, bowed his head, then opened his Bible. "Today's text is from the Old Testament," he said in the steadiest voice he could muster. "It is the 137th Psalm." Outside, men and women looked through the windows, straining for a glimpse of the preacher through the bodies of the people standing inside. He took a deep breath and read, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" He stopped there. The rest of the psalm about dashing babies against stones was simply too much. And after a prayer and a lot of wandering around, he really didn't want to tell these people this. He talked about the Hebrews, and he talked about the Exodus, and he talked about Jesus and everything he could think of, and finally he just had to come to the point. Friends, and I call you that from the bottom of my heart, for I have known you a long time. I have rejoiced and suffered and eaten and drunk with you, and now I have a thing to tell you, so I might as well get on with it. Friends, it is official. This valley will become part of the new Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He paused, bravely hoping to look them one by one in the eye, but could not. Silas said, "God Almighty," under his breath. Tears sprang to Levi Marion's eyes as he lowered his head into his hands. Valerie put her arm around him and took his hands in a tableau repeated throughout the church. And he goes on to explain some of the terms that they will have to put up with. And I think Steve will probably tell you that there were people who left and people who decided, I think I'm going to stay and see if I can outfox these people.
I will in a minute, but where did this park come from? How did we get the park? There was a movement in the late 1890s. We already had some parks out west, particularly Yellowstone. And people said we need a park in the east. So I've got a copy of a letter here from the Asheville Auditorium Company. W.T. Weaver, President, George S. Powell, Secretary and Treasurer. Asheville, NC, January 8, 1900. We, the undersigned, hereby agree to loan to the Appalachian National Park Association the sum opposite our names for the purpose of defraying the expenses of 2 men to go to Washington in regard to the park movement. This is hard to read. This loan is made with the understanding that the same is to be refunded out of the funds collected by the committee of the undersigned. This sum is payable upon demand of the Secretary of the Park Association. It is further understood that this fund is to be used in paying expenses and services of 2 men at the present short session of Congress. It's signed by Chase Ambler, the ones I can read, George Powell, Thomas Settle, R.L. Howland, F.W. Graham, H. Tyler Rogers, Charles A. Webb, who was then the publisher of the Asheville Citizen and went on to be one of the founders of the park, Clayton Claybrooks, and some names I can't read. They raised a grand total of $620,000. Excuse me, $620. Everybody gave $50 except H. Rogers Taylor, who promised $20. So that was how it started, and at the same time there was a group in Knoxville doing the same thing. The first place the North Carolina group looked at was up around Grandfather Mountain. And they talked about that, but the Tennessee people said, no, it's got to be closer to Knoxville. So they settled on the Smokies. But once again, well, that area right there is the park. That's what they settled on. They decided that they needed some help, so they went to New York and they got the services of a PR firm. Now, here's the test question. Where did the term Great Smokies come from? It came from the PR firm. They said, why don't you call it the Great Smokies? And that's where the term came from. Everybody else just called it the Smokies up to then. So in the 20s, work started in earnest on this, and there was a big drive with school children on both sides of the mountain to get nickels and dimes, and they raised some money. Each state legislature, and this was in the 20s when there was money, put up $2 million to buy the land, but they were still very short. And finally, the Rockefeller family gave a donation of $5 million to establish this park. So between the Rockefellers and both states, that was $9 million, and then the school kids and some little money, that was what they had. And so on May the 22nd, 1926, Congress established the park. but prohibited the use of federal monies for the purchase of land for the park. So the feds can look at these people and say, well, we didn't buy your land. So the park was established and the money was raised, and then that's where Wayne's story came from at the church. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about the park? The Great Smoky Mountains were described as, quote, a lumberman's dream. Most of the northeastern part of the United States houses were built with logs from the Smokies. You know, it was hardwood. For instance, I've got a paper that says in the Appalachians, every fourth tree was a chestnut. And everything lived off the chestnut. And they estimated there were 3.4 billion chestnut trees. And there are none today. Well, there was in Little River in Tennessee, there was a huge lumber company. In Big Creek in North Carolina, as you go down I-40, if you look at where you see where the power plant is, that's Big Creek coming out. There's a huge valley and watershed up there. That was the Suncrest Lumber Company. They employed 2,000 people between Suncrest and Walnut Bottoms up there. And at the height of their production, they were cutting 150,000 board feet a day of lumber to be shipped out. Champion Paper owned Smokemont, which is just past Oconee Lifting near Cherokee. In the park were 18 large tracks, mainly by lumber companies, 1,152 small tracks, which were the Caldwell's place, my grandfather's place. It took them 12 years to purchase all the land. It started in 1944. In this area lived 5,600 people that were displaced by this park. Now, what did they get for the land? Well, the Suncrest Lumber Company had 32,853 acres, for which they got $300,000. For you who are challenged math-wise, that's $9.13 an acre. But it was probably steep mountain land that had been cut over, so what was it worth? My grandfather's place had 152 acres with a tax value of $1,200, a house, a barn, storage buildings, and so forth. Fields, he had an orchard, some woodlands. It appraised at $5,752, but after my father sued the park or the federal government, they got $11,000. Mac Hanna had 152 acres, and he got $11,000 when it was all said and done. So the people moved out. Well, it was hard. I mean, you can imagine these were pioneers, these were settlers, these were people who had built this land and built these valleys and these houses, and it was an emotional time. These were not hillbillies or mountain people. These were basically mountain farmers. They were fairly prosperous. The center of all of this community was the church, and they were, you know, a fairly well-educated, hard-working family for that time in that place. But they weren't all sad to go. This was at the height of the Depression, 1936. Cataloochee was very remote. There was no work for the young people unless you wanted to stay on the farm. There was nothing for you to do. There was no telephone, no electricity, no paved road, no railroad, no doctor, and it was a way of life that was ending in this remote valley. And so they left, and they were given a life estate. Wayne?
Some of them got that life estate and stayed, and I'm real glad that Steve's grandfather was one of those people, because he let me borrow him for this book that I was writing. It's a very gracious thing to do, loan your grandfather out. He became Silas Wright in the book, and I look at old Silas as sort of my ideal of a mountain guy. He's stubborn, he's proud, he's stubborn and he's proud. And he just doesn't want this government telling him what to do. But the government, of course, did. The lease that you got was a lifetime lease, but it was renewable annually. And you had to do it in cash money. You couldn't do it with a promissory note or any of that kind of thing. Another nice thing about Steve is that he loaned me a letter that his grandfather had received from the superintendent of the Park Service, which I'm repeating almost verbatim in this passage I'm reading here. It's about what you do when you are trying to live with the government and you don't really want to do any of that stuff. I mean, the government restrictions were bad enough. They wouldn't let you fish except with artificial bait, and you had to hunt in season, and that, you know, that's just kind of a pain, but you can live with that. But they wouldn't let you cut firewood. So how are you going to heat your house? And they wouldn't let you pasture your cattle on the higher pastures. You couldn't use the balls anymore. So that meant you had to bring your cattle down into the valleys, and that meant you couldn't grow anything down there, and so you had to go out of the cattle business or go, you see the dilemmas. And then here's another little thing here. I'm not even mentioning the restriction against making, selling, or possessing liquor. These are mountain people. They don't pay any attention to that. Silas getting up in the morning, he lit the lamp and dressed by its flickering light. He almost never looked in the mirror over the washstand, but this morning lingered at a scarecrow of a man, lined like a bad road. If he thought of himself at all, it was as a man of 30, a full head of brown hair, ears unlike an elephant. He shook his head as he raked a wet comb through his hair, covering bald patches big as tomatoes. Some old son of a bitch the government's about to evict, he said, frowning. In the kitchen he lit lamps, built a fire, and checked on a funnel spider beside the wood box. I won't kick you out, old man, he said, peering into a silken cone in which legs were poised to grab breakfast. If they send me out, I'll take you with me. He sighed, poured a drink, and sat at the table, upon which lay a letter. August 25th, 1934, Mr. Silas Wright, Cataloochee, North Carolina. Dear Mr. Wright, replying to your letter of the 22nd, I regret to advise you that all lease fees, both state and federal, are cash in advance, and I cannot make exceptions to this rule. Indeed, I might add, no farming will be permitted until the fees have been paid. Regretting my inability to give you more time on this, and trusting that you will give the matter your prompt attention, I am yours very truly, J.R. Evans, Superintendent. I never met the real first superintendent of this park, but he was awfully easy to make fun of. And I'm not the only one who did it. So what Silas decides to do with this letter is just not reply to it, but he takes it to Jim Hawkins, who's the warden, as they were called then. We call them rangers now, but he takes it to Jim for advice. Silas took Evan's letter from his inside pocket and spread it on the table. I don't know how serious to take this. Jim read the letter and laid it face up like the last card in a game of stud poker. I'd have to study about that, Silas. He means what he says, of course. Will you send the money? Not inclined to. I know that. I ask if you will. What if I didn't? I assume you have it. Of course I do. I also have principles. Jim chuckled. So you ask me, who makes his living with the service, whether you ought to disobey it. Who better to ask? Well, I have principles too. Jim, we all got them. Question is, do we have loyalties? What do you mean? I need to know if I'm asking somebody who's first a human being and my Christian neighbor, or a man who's a dad-Jim government employee before he's a human being. Well, let me put it this way. You can trust me. If I need to tell you something you don't care to hear, I'll do it. Fair enough. Okay. So what does he mean by no farming? How do you not farm? Does that mean I can't milk until I pay up? Jim smiled. I'd milk just to keep the cow quiet. Of course, the only way to enforce that is for him to catch you farming, whatever that means, and he's pretty busy. So I could sow corn and go ahead like last year and send my money after I sell my cattle? I didn't say that. All I meant was you could likely get away with it, unless, of course, Evans told me to enforce it. Now we get down to it. Say you got orders to get that $60 from old Wright up there. What then? I'd be obliged to ask for it by mail, because I wouldn't want to catch you farming.
Wayne said $60. The actual figure was $16, and I don't think they had it. Now we got the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and since I'm on the board of the Friends of the Smokies, let's talk about the park a little bit itself. We've already pointed out where it is, and I'll be up here later. What makes the Smokies different from the rest of the national parks in the nation? Well, one is it's the only park that was formed out of private land. All that land in there was private land. There was no government land in there. When you go out west, most of that was just land that the government owned, and they just said it's a park. A few parks, probably Arcadia, some of that was private land, but this was all private land. It's the only park that was basically formed from private funds. Otherwise, no federal government money ever went in to establish this park. The state of Tennessee and North Carolina and the school children, and particularly the Rockefellers, established it. It's in 2 states. It's about 510,000 acres. There is a little bit more in North Carolina than Tennessee, but it's in 2 states. And it touches 8 counties plus the Cherokee Indian Reservation, which makes an interesting situation when it comes to law enforcement and who your friends are. It is the only park where a lot of people lived. And as I said earlier, there were 5,600 people that were evacuated or had to leave this park, and they had 1,152 tracts of land. There's only one road through the park, and that's 441, that goes from Cherokee over to Gatlinburg. Most parks, you can drive around a lot of them. Now, you can drive into Cates Cove, you can drive into Cataloochee, and that's about it. It's a very remote park. A lot of it's just wilderness. There's only one place to stay in the park, one park lodge. That's Mount LeConte, up on top of Mount LeConte, which is at 6,578 feet, and the only way to get there is walk. That's the only place to stay. Most parks have, they have accommodations in the park. Now, Elkmont, which is over near Cates Cove, there was a little community over there, and they're starting to redo some of those cottages, and maybe in the future you could stay there, but not right now. So it only has one lodge. The land next to the park, if you look at the Tennessee side of the park, all of that land, this is right up through here, all that land, all of the park butts private land. So you've got development right up to the park boundary. In fact, there's a restaurant in Gatlinburg, it's about as far from here, the table, from the park boundary. That's not true on the North Carolina side, because you've got all of Fontana, and coming around through here, you've got an awful lot of the Pisgah National Forest. So, except for a little bit around Bryson City, except for the Cherokee Indian Reservation, a little bit up toward the Swag up above Haywood County, private land does not butt against the park boundary. That's the difference. Makes it real nice too, I might add. There are a lot of population differences. There are more people that live in Knox County than live from Asheville West. So there are just an awful lot of people over there. If you look at Sevier County, which is Sevierville and Pigeon Forge in Tennessee, that's their 4th highest sales tax base, is that county. So they have all that over there. In Cates Cove, which is in Tennessee, right down here, if Cates Cove were a separate park, it would be the 6th most visited park in the nation. They have over 2 million people a year go to Cates Cove. That's where the big storm was last week. The other unique thing about the Smokies, and this is really, really unique, it is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world. And that's beginning known. We have either 136 or 137 species of trees. Most of Europe has 7. through the Friends of the Smokies and some other people, we helped establish what's known as Discover Life in America. It's been about 10 years old, and scientists coming in and looking at everything in the park. They won't try to find out what's in the park. Some more figures. Through 2011, they have discovered 915 species new to science and 7,100 species new to the Smokies that they didn't know were there. Now, after our program, there's a table right out here that Hannah is going to man, and we have some of this information on the Smokies, Friends of Smokies, and DLIA, and you're certainly welcome to pick one up. So that is really what is different with the Smokies. Wayne? Then I'm going to tell a couple of stories and we'll take questions.
I was going to talk a little bit about the difference in history and fiction, but I think I'd rather read this instead. This is a piece that hasn't been published anywhere and probably never will be, but it talks to the process of putting a novel together a little bit, and I think you might like it. Recently, someone asked me what I do. I'm a writer, I said. What do you write? Fiction. I forget. Is that the kind that's true or not? I can't tell you how many times people have said that to me. It's just, I just don't know. And people really don't appreciate it when I answer yes to that question. But it's the best answer I can offer. And here we come to what I call the Caldwell divide. What is history and what is fiction? On which side of the mountain do you live? History is never 100% accurate except on the simplest of levels. We can, for example, all agree that George Washington was born in 1732. We also know he had false teeth because they still exist, and he wrote about how uncomfortable they were. But what about the cherry tree? That story was pushed in my elementary school as akin to gospel, but Mason Weems, his early biographer, was known to tell, as Mark Twain called them, stretchers. This likely was one, along with pitching that coin across the Potomac. Or was it the Rappahannock, and was it a nickel, or was it $1, or what? I mean, you know, there's history, to be sure, is only as good as its eyewitnesses. And we all know that eyewitnesses to a crime, for example, see situations very differently. Ask any trial judge. Or look at ancient history. You think all those Greek and Roman pre-battle speeches that George Patton plagiarized were written down faithfully by eyewitnesses? I doubt that. So, you can't trust history. Can you trust fiction? Only when it's not playing with you. There is, for example, a modern thing called the unreliable narrator. The author sets up a character who lies for some reason. In Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he's insane. In Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, he's naive. In Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, you simply don't know which viewpoint to believe. Or as in John Barth's work, where people write about people writing about writing a story. No way to trust that. So let's find a piece of historical fiction with an omniscient author and a linear time frame. Caldwell would be a perfectly random contemporary example. How true is it? Well, here's one chapter, Plow New Ground. In it, Marion Carter is killed by a huge limb falling out of a burning tree. Now, the fact is that my great-grandfather, Marion Caldwell, was killed by a tree when he was plowing in Caldwell. Other than an identifiable date of death, that's all I know about that day. One short sentence. And that incident turned into 12 typeset pages. That chapter is true to the extent that I did my research well, and my people are in character for the period and place. Would they have rung the school bell for an emergency? Would the women have gathered at Lizzie's place? Would they have laid him out? Would they have stopped the clock? Would they have eaten fried chicken? I think they would have. To that extent, this is a true story. Did a shooting occur in Cataloochee on October 1st, 1928? No. Did such a man as Ezra Banks live in Cataloochee? Probably not. And just as a footnote to that sentence, I was at reunion one year and this little blue-haired lady walked up to me and she said, "I'm Will Messer's granddaughter." Oh hell, I thought, here it comes, because Ezra lived about the same place in Little Cataloochee that Will Messer lived, and they shared some similarities. They both grew apples and they both had money and this, that, and the other. And she just looked at me and said, "He didn't drink like that." And she turned around and left, and I thought, well, Grandpa was mean as a snake, but he didn't drink that one. You know. Sometimes you get scared. Let's see. Did Ezra Banks live in Cataloochee? Probably not. That means none of the material about Ezra Banks' killing and the trial of his son is true. Oliver Babcock never existed except in my mind. Hannah Banks never laid out a hand of solitaire, and so forth. Where did Ezra come from? He's based on a character from Buncombe County. I think he transplanted well, but there's not a speck of Cataloochee historical truth in his story, and he's the main character in this fool novel. So the question becomes, was there ever such a man as Ezra Banks? And if so, could he have lived in Cataloochee from 1880 to 1928, at which time he had become such a stinker that either his son or his daughter-in-law killed him? I think the answer to that is yes. So, is this omniscient author reliable? Toward the end of Cataloochee, Jake Carter tells Oliver, "The only truth in this mess is that Ezra Banks is dead. Once you know that one fact, how he got that way don't matter." The barber, Sam McCrory, tells Oliver, the lawyer, "If the jury has to sit there, they want something worth listening at. They don't even mind getting lied to if it's a good story." Jake later makes a joke out of a reference to Francis Bacon's "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer at the end of chapter 35. So perhaps our omniscient author is messing with us a little, just for fun. But is he reliable? Ask it this way. Is he writing about what Faulkner called the human heart in conflict with itself? Listen to the Dixie Limited, which is what Flannery O'Connor called Bill Faulkner, and I think that's just wonderful. The writer leaves no room in his workshop for anything but the old verities and truths of the heart, the old universal truths lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. And that's from Faulkner's Nobel Prize speech. If I have come anywhere close to that, I have been reliable and written a truthful account of something that might well have been.
Before we take questions, you want a story, a true story. There's been enough time that the statute of limitations for arson has passed by, so let me tell this story. It's in Wayne's book, and it's true. You remember that in 1900, the population was 1,251 people. That's a lot of people, and you can assume that there were a lot of kids, because in my father's family, there were 8. And they had an old school, and they needed a new school. So my grandfather, Steve Woody, George Caldwell, and George Palmer, being leading citizens of the valley, decided that they would go to Waynesville and talk to the county commissioners and get them a new school. So they rode to Waynesville. Now, I've heard this story many times. I was not there. And they went in to see the county commissioners, and the county commissioners talked down to them. And they said, well, you don't pay a lot of taxes over there, and there are not a whole lot of people that vote, and times are hard. And, you know, they were from Waynesville, they were city people, and these were mountain people that come in, and they said, we can't build you a school. So they started back to Cataloochee, and they were not happy. and they stopped and they bought some cheese and crackers and some bonded whiskey. And they rode up to Cove Creek Gap, and it was starting to get dark, and they rested the horses and got off. And they spread, they got some cheese and crackers, and they discussed the situation. And they didn't like it because they'd been talked down to. And they had a drink, and this is true, that a drink of bonded whiskey will bring clarity to a complicated situation. So they rode down to the school, and they took the desk out of the school and they put them way out in the field. They took the blackboards off the wall, they were probably slate, put them on top of the desk. They had already put the books on top of the desk so the blackboards were on top of it. If there were any sweaters or little coats left there, they put them under there so the dew wouldn't get them wet. They took a match and put it to the school. And they shook hands and said, "We won't mention a word of this until 2 have died." So the next morning, my father and his brothers and sisters, my father was probably 6 or 7 when this happened, got their little sacks with their lunch in it and walked the 2 miles down the creek, down the road down the creek to the school, and the school was gone. And they had school in the church, and they had school in one of the cabins for about 2 years, and then they got a new school, and it's still over there, the Beech Grove School. Now fast forward from there for probably about 30 or 35 years. I'm not real sure. And my father lived in Atlanta, and he came up to see my grandfather, and I can picture this. They were sitting on the porch, and they're having a drink of bonded whiskey. And my grandfather said, "Son, George Caldwell has been dead, and George Palmer died about a month ago, and I need to tell you something." Well, my father thought it was wonderful, and the newspaper was told, and it has been but that's true. That was how they got the new school in Cataloochee. And you got a story?
Well, just simply to say that I've heard this story from several different directions, and Steve's version of it I like the best because it's almost verifiable. When you get a Caldwell telling this story, they tend to try to leave the Woodies out of it. I've heard versions of, well, they didn't really ever go to Waynesville. They just said they were going to Waynesville, and they just went up there and got drunk and came down and burned the school. But I chose to begin Requiem by Fire with that story for a good reason. One, it begins the fire motif in the book, and the other, it's just a heck of a good story. So there you go.
One more story, then we'll take questions. My father would come up from Atlanta, where he was working. This was before I was born. And, he would bring some bonded whiskey, but you couldn't give it all at once, because grandfather might drink it up all at once. So he would, give him one right there, and then he'd hide 5 or 6 around the place. And about once a week, he'd write him a letter. And I have one of these letters with a little map on it. And this is dated October the 3rd, 1938, which even predates me. And he talks about it's my father's birthday and so forth, and he says, "Oh yes, I forgot. If you go across the creek and go up to the fence that divides the 2 fields and the place where the fence is down, if you look up the fence 9 panels and look behind 4 poplar saplings, you will find your refreshments." This one ought not to be as hard to find as the other one. Which begs the question, did he get a letter back from my grandfather saying where? The branch comes right down close to the fence. "Trust all the well, love Jonathan." So those are 2 Cataloochee stories for you, and we'll take questions. Wayne, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Wayne.
I have two questions. Are the Elks in Big Cataloochee or Little Cataloochee?
They're in Big Cataloochee.
Okay. And then, why did your family change the spelling of your name? And did all Caldwells change, or did some stick with the old spelling?
That orthography in 18th and 19th century America is about as fluid a thing as you can find. Caldwell, Colwell, and Caldwell are pretty much interchangeable. And at some point, some of them decided CALD was how they were going to do it. That's as close as I can get to it on that. It's like my wife's family. She comes from a bunch of Robertsons, which are also Robinsons, which are also Robertsons, and you know, you're going back in the genealogy thing, and you just, well. But that's just the nature of spelling in American life.
I don't know you if you're, this is a shy audience, I can't believe this.
Well, I think they just did a wonderful job of explaining.
Wayne, I'd like to understand a little more fully what brought you from that impulse that this was a good place to set a novel to actually doing it. I mean, you had the family connections, you didn't live far away, etc. But what inside you really got you deciding to do a novel about it all?
I turned 50. And that is not a flip answer. That's the gospel truth. I turned 50. I said to myself, you've been wanting to write for a long time. If you're ever going to do it, get off your butt and do it. And the first thing I tried to write was a short story that finally appeared in the Carolina Alumni Review. They were having a short story contest that year, open to alumni, and I thought, well, I'll try and, you know, just see. And blamed if I didn't win the contest. And I got a check, and I got my name in print, and that's a marvelous incentive to keep going. And one thing led to another. I won another short story prize or two, and finally, after I had a whole series of sketches, I began to see, you know, this hangs together, and this belongs over here, and this, that, and the other. And Cataloochee came out of that. So, but it was really one of those life events. It was. I turned 50, and all of a sudden, you know, you realize, you know, I'm not 30 anymore. I need to do this, and I did.
Thank you. Steve, I'm interested in your comment about it was a lifestyle which was close to its end, and you're working with Friends of the Smokies now. I would have expected a little more resentment against the national park on the part of the people who were there, but it doesn't seem to have happened. Is that a fair assessment?
In a way. There was resentment by a lot of the old people. You know, you're leaving your home. I mean, in the park, went in right after they left and burned a lot of the houses down. Now just, you know, think about that. You know, the park has gone through several evolutions about what they want to do. Take it back to nature, keep it like it was, so forth. That's the nature of government and bureaucracy. But a lot of them felt badly, but they did have money. This is the height of the Depression, and they had some cash. Most of them that came out wound up living around Jonathan's Creek, Maggie Valley, you know, that part of Haywood County. A lot of them did. Some of them spilled over into Candler and so forth, but they stayed around. But most of the young people by then had gone, and there was a resentment and so forth. But that's one thing that draws everybody back to this reunion. I think now my generation and my daughter's generation are glad the park is there, because they could see what would have happened to that all, you know, this whole area had not the park come. Yeah.
How has the Appalachian Trail affected the park going through there?
I don't think it's had a negative impact at all. It starts, you know, it's a long way through the park. It's 70 miles, I think. Yeah. You know, it's just one of the joys of having this park is you got the Appalachian Trail running through it. And it runs up to well over 6,000 feet. It's the highest part of the trail, goes through the park. Now, Friends of Smokies, I got to brag on Friends of Smokies. We just finished raising an endowment of $4 million, which funds a whole second permanent trail crew in the Smokies. There's almost 900 miles of trails in the Smokies with a lot of hiking. And I went on one of the trails they just redid, and it's wonderful. So, yeah, that hiking is a big part of the trail.
I have a question for Wayne. Microphone. One of the things that we know about the mountains is the sort of informality of life there, and it's expressed quite effectively through music. But I was wondering, in the case for authors, is there a strong tradition of storytelling that influenced your, sort of inspired you to get into, being an author yourself?
The short answer to that question is no. And it's mainly because, as I said about my father, I grew up in a tradition which did not go to the reunion, and we didn't sit around and swap family stories and all of that sort of thing. It just wasn't close to me when I grew up. My connection with Appalachian storytelling really began with a book that Chuck mentioned last week, the Richard Chase book, The Jack Tales. And I read that in probably the, sixth grade or something like that. And that sort of storytelling, in an academic sort of sense, has been very close to me. So yeah, I had that. But as far as I don't go to storytelling conventions and that sort of thing. But I do love a good story. And if you thought we had about 3 or 4 minutes, I'll read you one. That actually came out of the oral tradition to me. The background for it is that we have a little place down in Hot Springs, and we have a neighbor down there who found out we were living in the old Davis place. Well, Mr. Davis was a bootlegger. Well, I knew that, but she gave me some details about Mr. Davis that I just couldn't wait to get back home and write down. So this is a little bit about Willard Davis here. I transplanted him from Madison County to Cataloochee, by the way. This is from my new book. Willard Davis wasn't blood kin. We called our elders Uncle such and such or Aunt so and so out of respect. Tall, dressed in black, he carried a silver railroad watch on a chain. Almost everybody in the valley farmed. Like my father, most grew oats and hay, corn and apples, and raised hogs, sheep, cattle, and children. Uncle Willard, however, was nearly a one-crop man. He grew food for his table and rations for his kennels, but 90% of his yield was corn, which he turned into whiskey, which I am told was very, very good. He lived across Indian Creek from Uncle Will Carter's mill in a 4-room house dug into the hillside, a perfect site for a cool basement in which to store his supplies. Across the front ran a porch about 5 feet off the ground, supported by the basement's forward wall. It had a narrow gate of a door you stooped to get through, even at my age. He kept 2 packs of dogs, one to guard the house, the other the still. I never knew what breeds they were. Mixed is a polite description. All were mean. No single cur was quite Faulkner's lion, but the pack would have eaten the fictional dog for breakfast. They didn't much like people they knew, except for Uncle Willard, and they'd been known to expose leg bones of strangers with no provocation at all. So my hero here takes his father visiting over to Uncle Willard's one afternoon. A good quarter mile before Uncle Willard's place, we heard a veritable symphony of dogdom. Some sounded vicious, ready to kill. Some proud, like they'd treated the biggest coon in the county. Others yapped and snarled like they were up to their eyelids and writhing snakes. Papa and I looked at each other, and he grinned and pointed. In a turnout sat a green Chevrolet coupe, driven over the mountain the day before by a dandy who claimed he wanted to lay out a bedroll and trout fish. In jacket and necktie? Everybody said he smelled like a revenue agent, so we figured those dogs were tearing him to pieces. When we turned the corner, we saw no tax man, only Uncle Willard, rocking, paring his fingernails as calmly as a doctor writing a prescription. Dogs boiled around the basement door. When Papa raised a greeting hand, Uncle Willard waved us over. I don't know what he said to the canines, but they suddenly fell silent, like he'd flipped a switch. As we approached the porch, those rascals sat, as innocent as RCA's nipper, except great gobs of slobber strung down their chests. And they visit for a little while, and Papa asked, "What's got them dogs riled up?" "I think I got a city mouse in the basement." Been at it a while? Papa drained the dipper and handed it back. Uncle Willard took out his watch. "All morning. Long about dawn, somebody shut an automobile door, but I didn't hear Pete Turkey Boo out of them varmints. It's the beatin'est thing. Don't know how City Mouse managed to reach the yard without rousing them fool dogs. Must have used some kind of spell. It wore off quick, though, 'cause next thing I knowed, they started a ruckus, and I reckon the basement was the first hidey hole he found. Been at it ever since, like they're trying to make amends for messing up and letting him in." "How long you gonna keep him?" "City Mouse? I might let him out after a while if he'll promise never to show his sorry face again. If he won't, I'll leave him down there till them dogs gets him or he rots one." When he whistled, they started in again. They'd tunneled their way in soon enough. I imagined a man inside, on his knees, praying for intervention, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the Red Sea fell on Pharaoh's army. Hoping to God that "knock and it shall be opened unto you" could not possibly apply to a gang of dogs. We heard later Uncle Willard called them off about supper time. Took a shotgun and flashlight and opened the basement door. He cocked that 12-gauge loaded with double-aught buckshot and shone that light onto a whimpering mess of a man curled in the corner. "Get up," Uncle Willard said, but trapped like that possum in our rabbit gum, the man didn't move. Uncle Willard blasted the floor not 2 feet from his head, and they said when Uncle Willard picked him up by the shirt collar, he'd lost both bowel and bladder and turned deaf as a post. He spent the next day sitting in the Chevrolet gibbering in some unknown tongue. That night he cranked the automobile and drove all the way to old Silas Wright's place, the wrong way to get out of the valley. By the time the man found his bearings, he'd run through 6 or 8 flower beds, knocked down 2 sections of fence, and been shot at several times. He left behind a service revolver, with which Uncle Willard became quite proficient, and a hat and jacket Uncle Willard's dogs tore up and ate for breakfast. Don't let anybody tell you the oral tradition is dead. It is not.
Today, both of you are very much involved with Habitat for Humanity. Is there any connection between your heritage out of Cataloochee and your love for building homes for Habitat?
Well, gosh, I've never paused to reflect about that.
I am either.
Steve, you want to take that one?
Well, I guess I got involved in Habitat because my wife was on the Habitat board. And we do an Episcopal house every other year. So, yeah, it's a great, great organization.
In Cataloochee today. I live in Candler, Upper Hominy, and I walk in the mornings with a couple folks, second generation removed from natives in Cataloochee. And let me tell you, there's strong resentment towards the government, even into the second generation, and it just gets passed on.
What I can say to that is that I know people on both sides of that fence. I am, like Steve said, I'm very proud that that land is not developed and that there's not a chalet or whatever on every green hill out there. But I'm also very aware that I know people who, as you say, still carry that resentment with them. It's kind of like a scab on their shoulders or back or something like that, and it's very real to them. And all I can say about that is I'm sorry. One of the reasons I wrote these two books, in retrospect, is to say there was a human cost to this park, and people who don't realize that need to realize it. I didn't set out to write a book about the park, but that's what it turned out to be.
I'll respond, excuse me, I'll respond to that. I do know some of these people with resentment down 2 generations, but to me, what they want is, I want it like it was. You know, this era has passed on. You know, I just wish it were like it was, but it isn't. And of course, you know, you look at Cataloochee, and then of course you can look at what happened up at Hazel Creek when the dam was built, you know, the Fontana Dam. And, you know, like Wayne says, there was a lot of human tragedy here, a lot of loss.
Well, isn't it a little bit like, you know, no whiteness is as white remembered? But I think that one of the things that impressed me about what you're talking about the park is that these very things that are the problems, the unique problems of the park, like its great isolation and so on, surely that adds, doesn't it, to the fact that you still have this great biodiversity and this ability to look at nature that even if the residents were there with their progeny as life went on, that would have been lost to all of us. And it is a terrible, I do agree that there's a terrible human cost. It seems to me that you were saying that what you gain for all of us, for a larger community, is totally precious, and it wouldn't be there if we had the other things. Seems like every choice has got a downside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you think about farming and that kind of thing. If the Cataloochans had not been bothered, and if they had been allowed to continue what essentially was what we now think of as organic farming, they would have been, after the war, they would have been into the chemicals and the fertilizers and the DDT and all of that sort of stuff. There wouldn't be a Tweety bird over there now, you know? So you trade one thing for another. I know my father always made a garden, and he thought 7 was the best thing in the whole world, and I think they maybe outlawed it by now, but you know, love to dust them tomatoes, you know.
I feel as if I have been a very privileged fly on the wall, listening to a great conversation among 2 old friends. Steve Woody, Wayne Caldwell, thank you very much.